Hello. Um, I'm going to make this video, or I am making this video, um, because this AOS issue is prevalent, and it's something that we all have to deal with on these 996s and 997s even, I guess. But anyhow, it's a deficient product, and Porsche knows it, just like they knew about the IMS bearing, etc. You know, they don't like to admit this, but anyhow, I struggled with what I was going to do, you know, as far as replacement. So I finally decided I'm going with the UAOS, the Ultimate AOS, because it rectifies the issue of having to rip into this engine. The AOS is positioned in the very front of the engine, which means towards the front of the car, and it's not accessible. You got to rip into this engine and take a bunch of components off to get to it. You can't see where the bolts are. There's only two bolts that hold it, but you can't see them. You got to use mirrors, or you got to feel it. You got to know where they are. The 3.4 and the 3.6 are completely different as far as how the AOS mounts to the engine. So the reason I'm making this video is because I gathered all this different information. I wrestled with these components and how to get them off, and there's no clear, definitive way to do them. Everybody's got an opinion on how to do it. So I'm going to show you how I did it and kind of explain along the way why I did it. I don't like these big old long introductions, but anyhow, that's what I'm doing. So bear with me. Thanks. Okay, so this is what it looks like with everything off. And I'm going to kind of go over what I took off. But once you get the manifold off and the expansion tank out of there, and I had to take the alternator out because this thing broke, and the AOS goes way back there where that yellow rag is. Okay, so everything's out. This is what it looks like prior to reinstall. So we've got a UAOS coming. I'll put that in first. That's way back there where the yellow rag is. First thing I did was I lowered the engine off the mounts so that the tranny and bell housings are sitting on that cross member. So that does allow you a little extra space, a few inches, to be able to, you know, reach in over the top of the engine. But man, there's a lot of hoses, and it was tough. You can see that this expansion tank had to come out, and the secondary air pump, because you can't reach your hand in here to get to these bolts on the intake. And this also, I saw different videos and such that said remove this. So I did. Just this cap. This is bleeder. This is some bleeder port or something for the fuel rail. But that helps a little bit, but it doesn't do the whole trick. This is part of the cooling system. This is rigid here, and it does not move. So trying to wrestle that tank out, it kept going against this and going against this. And then I finally, I'll show you in a second here, removed the bracket that bolts into the top of the engine compartment here. Okay, so first thing I did was remove the belt, probably get a new one. Then I removed the air filter box, videos and all this stuff. Secondary air pump had to come out. Then I removed this throttle body. Then I was able to remove this rear plenum here. Couldn't get the back plenum, the front plenum out at that time. But then I had to wrestle with this expansion tank, which is a bear.
the space is just so limited. Anyhow, this is what bolts to the top of the engine compartment, this bracket, which holds the tank in place. You see these slots. You move this thing just a tad, not all the way because it won't come out, but you move it just enough so that these line up, and this will drop down a little bit. Then once you get that out, you kind of twist it and turn it and move it over so that you can gain access to the bolts that go in here. Okay, and you know, you use your best contortionist abilities to move this out of the way and drop it down just enough to get a small ratchet in here, socket. You got to remove this thing. It will not come out without removing that. So that was the worst part of the job. I couldn't get that tank out. This is 3.6, so I just couldn't get it out without removing that bracket. And I spent a couple days wrestling with it, you know, an hour here, 15 minutes there, and finally had to walk away a couple times and did some research and was lucky enough to find some posts on, like, I think it was Renlist, I don't remember, where a guy says you got to take that bracket off. There's no way to do it. So yeah, he was right. Okay, so once I was able to get the expansion tank off, I was ready to start removing the intake. And of course you can't get to these bolts, which are these Torx heads. And the Torx socket I had wouldn't fit in, so I couldn't use that. I used this 1/4 inch with an 8mm socket that fits on these bolts real nice and tight. So remove that. And then you can't get the front plenum out because it's very tight in there until you loosen the intake manifold enough to be able to twist it up like this. You still can't get it off. And then you can slide this out. But I couldn't get the intake off because this stupid AOS hose, which threads through and goes the other side of the engine, threads through this intake and also the right intake. So again, researching, found something where somebody says, hey, take that off the right side of the engine. It bolts on, so I did that and thread it through the right. Still couldn't get it off because this fitting goes on the AOS over here, and you have to pinch this, okay, pinch this on both sides, actually top and bottom, to release it. But you can't get to this bottom one because there's no room. Guess if you have the right kind of cable pliers or something, you can do it. Couldn't get that sucker off. This is the AOS. I'm not gonna put this factory. This is a Porsche part. I'm not putting it back on because I saw lots of videos where they're bad out of the box. Jake Raby said they're bad out of the box. So I finally, after threading the connector tube, took it off with the connector tube still connected to the AOS. So here is the AOS factory. It sits like that in the engine. And that was the last thing to come off. Along the way, I leaned against my oil filler tube, and the darn thing snapped. 86 bucks. 86 bucks. This plastic is getting brittle, you know. It's a 2004, so it's 18 years old. So I had to take the alternator out to get to this bolt here. Could get to the other one, but I couldn't get to that one, so that I could remove that. So I bought a new one, put it in, it's in place. So the procedure for putting this back in is I'm going to put the UAOS, which I've got ordered. It's on its way. I'm not going to use the factory because they're supposedly hit and miss with those things. I got 20,000 miles out of this. I had it done 4 years ago and put about 20,000 miles on it. I had the RMS done, the IMS done, water pump done, and the real issue was this thing was smoking like you wouldn't believe because the AOS had gone out. So they dropped the engine at my Indy. That's the easiest way to do all that stuff, of course, to get to IMS, but it's also easier to work on the AOS. But I lowered it. It is doable. It's a pain job. The reason I'm going with the UAOS is because they have put this top diaphragm here, which is what goes bad, towards the front of the engine with some hoses and stuff. They still sits in like so in the back, but if this does fail in the future, it's going to be close to where I don't have to drop the engine and remove all these components. So at any rate, you can see that you absolutely have to get the secondary air pump out. The coolant expansion tank has to come out because you can't get your arm in there. You might be able to get this bolt, but there's no way you can get your arm back there and get that. See that rear? There's a bolt there for that intake, way the heck back there. And then of course the AOS is right here. It sits up here vertically, and then the hose comes through. But UAOS will save me in the future from having to mess with this AOS. Because you know, lots of guys are saying those AOSs are bad from the factory. There's repair shops that are wasting big time and money because they fail on them when they do the test drives even. So it's a bad part. It sucks. That's why I'm going with the UAOS, and those guys are pretty sharp for coming up with that UAOS to rectify the situation. So this is part one. I'll show you some more later. Hopefully this helps you guys. It helped me after doing all the research. Oh, also I had to drop the coolant out of the engine because once you take this hose off here, that goes back to the AOS because there's coolant lines that go through there, and coolant started gushing out of here. So I dropped it out and lowered it. I had to take the coolant tank out anyhow. So that is it so far.